Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from. If these stories have become part of your nightly routine, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Now get comfortable, settle in, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin. In this new story, there are places along the Appalachian Trail where help is never truly close. A hiker may carry a satellite communicator and know exactly where the nearest road lies, yet reaching another person can still require hours of walking through steep forest. Experienced hikers understand that isolation and prepare for it. They know the sounds of black bears moving through brush, deer crossing campsites after dark, and branches falling without warning. That experience usually makes them less frightened by the wilderness. But in September of 2022, three longtime backpackers left a remote section of trail in Virginia several days earlier than planned. They were not injured, their equipment had not failed, weather remained almost perfect. What changed their plans was something they first noticed following them shortly before sunset, miles from the nearest road. The group consisted of Daniel Mercer, 58, his younger brother Stephen, and their longtime friend Paul. All three had spent more than 20 years hiking together throughout the Appalachian region. They were comfortable navigating without cellular service and carried enough food for 6 days. Their planned route covered approximately 40 miles through a mountainous section containing several shelters but few convenient access roads. Family members received regular satellite check-ins, and every message during the first 2 days indicated the trip was progressing normally. Late on the third afternoon, the men began descending toward a small backcountry shelter where they planned to spend the night. The trail crossed a narrow ridge before entering several miles of dense hardwood forest. They had seen only 2 other hikers since morning, both traveling in the opposite direction. Shortly before 6 o'clock, Daniel stopped after hearing something behind them. It sounded like a boot landing heavily on the trail. He turned, expecting another backpacker approaching from the ridge. Nobody was visible. The men continued walking. Several minutes later, the sound returned. One heavy step landed somewhere behind them, followed by silence. Stephen initially suspected a falling branch. Paul believed a deer might be crossing the trail. Neither explanation concerned them. Wildlife often moved close to hikers without being seen. They walked another quarter mile before hearing 2 more impacts. This time, all 3 stopped simultaneously. The forest behind them remained empty. Daniel waited almost a minute before continuing. He deliberately reduced his pace, expecting whoever was behind them to eventually catch up. Nothing did. The group then increased speed. Several minutes later, another step sounded from the same direction. The distance never seemed to change. Whatever was producing the noise remained somewhere beyond the last visible curve. They reached the shelter shortly before sunset. It was empty. The structure stood beside a small clearing with a spring located downhill. After dropping their backpacks, Stephen walked to collect water while Daniel and Paul prepared food. The strange footsteps were mentioned briefly, but nobody considered them dangerous. Their most likely explanation remained another hiker maintaining the same pace behind them. If so, that person would probably reach the shelter before darkness. Nobody arrived. As daylight disappeared, the men ate and stored their food properly before settling near the shelter. The temperature remained mild, and insects filled the forest with the usual late summer noise. Shortly after 9, Paul noticed a small point of white light among the trees north of the clearing. It resembled a headlamp several hundred yards away. The light disappeared almost immediately. 10 minutes later, Daniel saw it too. A single pale light appeared between 2 trees along the trail they had traveled earlier. It remained stationary for several seconds before vanishing. They assumed the delayed hiker was finally approaching and waited for the light to return closer to camp. It never did. Around 10:30, Stephen heard a footstep. This time, it came from the edge of the clearing. The 3 men immediately turned on their headlamps and searched the tree line. Nothing moved. They checked around the shelter, food storage area, and spring trail. No person was present. Daniel called into the darkness in case another hiker was trying to locate the shelter, but received no response. After several minutes, they returned to camp. The next sound came from the opposite side. It was not loud, there was no crashing through brush or rapid movement suggesting a large animal. Instead, something seemed to take one deliberate step among the leaves and then stop. Minutes later, another step came from farther around the clearing. The pattern continued irregularly for nearly an hour. Experienced hikers sometimes describe deer as surprisingly human when walking slowly through dry leaves. The men knew this and tried to locate eye reflections with their headlamps. They found none. Black bears were also common in the region, but a bear circling camp would normally produce considerably more disturbance. Whatever they were hearing seemed to move only when the clearing became quiet. Shortly before midnight, the forest itself changed. The insects stopped. Daniel later remembered that moment more clearly than anything else. The transition was not gradual. One moment, the clearing contained the continuous background noise expected during a warm September night. Seconds later, the surrounding forest seemed almost completely still. Then, the white light appeared again. It was farther into the trees than before, perhaps 80 yards from the shelter. The men could not determine its height because darkness concealed the ground beneath it. It remained visible for several seconds and then moved sideways. Not quickly, but smoothly enough that all three noticed it at once. Paul used a small monocular he carried for wildlife observation. By the time he focused on the location, the light had disappeared. Nobody slept much after that. The men kept their headlamps nearby and remained inside the shelter until the first gray light appeared between the trees. Nothing entered camp, no equipment was disturbed. When daylight finally returned, the forest looked completely ordinary. Daniel immediately inspected the ground surrounding the clearing. Overnight, conditions had been dry, making tracks difficult to identify. He found deer prints near the spring and several small animal tracks closer to the shelter. There were no obvious boot prints beyond those belonging to the three men. They considered continuing according to schedule. That decision changed when Stephen walked back toward the trail. About 40 yards north of the shelter, he found a backpack lying beside a tree. It was an older external frame pack, faded dark green and partially covered with leaves. At first, the men assumed it belonged to another hiker who had stepped away from the trail. They called repeatedly and searched the surrounding area. Nobody answered. The pack looked as though it had been outside much longer than one night. Fabric around the straps had faded, several metal components were heavily corroded, and leaves had accumulated beneath parts of the frame. Daniel did not open it. Instead, he photographed the location and marked the coordinates on his satellite device. The discovery changed the mood immediately. An abandoned backpack in remote terrain can indicate an injured or missing hiker. The group sent a non-emergency message through their satellite communicator describing what they had found. They received instructions not to disturb the pack and to continue toward their next planned checkpoint unless they encountered evidence of immediate danger. The men left shortly after 8. For almost 2 hours, nothing unusual happened. Morning sunlight reached the forest floor, birds moved through the canopy, and occasional hikers appeared traveling north. The previous night began to feel less threatening. Daniel even considered that an animal might have accounted for every unexplained sound. Then they reached a long uphill section several miles from the shelter. Paul heard the step again. One heavy impact came from behind them. All three stopped. Nothing followed. They resumed walking. 5 minutes later, another step sounded, then another, after several more minutes. The pattern was identical to what they had heard the previous afternoon. It never approached quickly enough to become visible, yet it never seemed to fall behind. Daniel decided to test it. The men stopped beside a large rock formation and remained completely still for nearly 15 minutes. 2 northbound hikers passed them during that period. Nobody else appeared. The forest behind them remained quiet. When the group started walking again, the sound returned within minutes. One step, then silence. Another step several minutes later. Stephen began recording audio on his phone while keeping it attached to the outside of his backpack. The group continued for almost an hour without stopping. They eventually reached an exposed section of ridge where visibility behind them extended several hundred yards. No person followed. The footsteps stopped there. The men ate lunch on the ridge and discussed their options. Their planned route would take them deeper into remote terrain for another 2 nights. The nearest practical exit was an access road roughly 7 miles ahead. None wanted to overreact to unexplained noises, but the combination of the previous night's activity and the abandoned backpack had changed their confidence in continuing. They unanimously decided to leave the trail that afternoon. Around 3 o'clock, they began descending toward the access road. The footsteps returned before 4. This time, they came from ahead. Daniel stopped first. The others heard another heavy step somewhere beyond a bend, approximately 100 yards down the trail. They waited. Nothing appeared. Another impact followed from roughly the same location. The men remained together and continued cautiously. When they reached the bend, the trail ahead was empty. Then a step sounded behind them. That was the moment they stopped treating the situation as an interesting wilderness mystery. They increased their pace toward the road. Nobody ran because the descending trail contained loose rocks and roots, but they no longer stopped to investigate sounds. Stephen continued recording. Over the next 40 minutes, the phone captured several dull impacts separated by long periods of ordinary forest noise. Audio specialists would later be unable to determine whether the sounds were footsteps, falling objects, or something else entirely. The men reached the access road shortly before sunset. A park ranger met them there after receiving updated satellite messages. The group appeared tired but otherwise healthy. They described the abandoned backpack first because it represented the only potential emergency. The ranger recorded the coordinates and contacted additional personnel to inspect the site. The following morning, 2 rangers reached the location near the shelter. They found the backpack exactly where Daniel had photographed it. Its contents included deteriorated camping equipment, an empty metal water bottle, a damaged flashlight, and several pieces of clothing. No identification was immediately visible. The equipment appeared old enough that investigators initially suspected it had been abandoned years earlier. A manufacturer later helped estimate the pack's production period. It had probably been sold sometime during the late 1980s or early 1990s. Investigators searched historical missing person and trail incident records, but could not confidently connect it with a specific hiker. Then, a ranger noticed something unusual about where it had been found. The backpack had not been lying beside the current Appalachian Trail when it was originally manufactured. Historical maps showed that this section of trail had been rerouted years earlier. The older route passed several hundred yards farther east before eventually reconnecting near the ridge. Whoever originally carried the backpack would have had little reason to be standing beside the modern trail unless it had been moved sometime after the rerouting. Investigators considered the obvious possibility that another hiker had discovered the old pack and relocated it. That would explain its position easily. Yet nobody reported finding or moving it, and the leaves accumulated around the frame suggested it had remained undisturbed for a considerable period. The 3 hikers were interviewed separately about their experience. Their descriptions of the strange footsteps remained consistent. None claimed to have seen a person following them. None described a creature or supernatural presence. The only visual event involved the distant white light near the shelter, which could easily have been another hiker's headlamp somewhere beyond the clearing. Investigators considered several ordinary explanations. Acorns and branches can strike the forest floor with surprising force. Deer sometimes shadow hikers because human movement disturbs vegetation and exposes food. Sound travels unpredictably across ridges. Another backpacker could have remained out of sight for long periods while maintaining a similar pace. Fatigue could also have made unrelated noises seem connected. Every explanation was reasonable. None accounted comfortably for the entire sequence. Stephen's audio recording added little certainty. Several impacts were clearly audible, but their distance and source could not be established. The recording also captured the men's footsteps, allowing analysts to compare them. Some unexplained impacts sounded remarkably similar to a boot striking compact soil, others did not. No criminal investigation followed. No missing hiker was discovered near the shelter, and nothing suggested the three men had been deliberately targeted. The old backpack was eventually transferred for further examination while the trail remained open. Hundreds of hikers subsequently traveled through the area without reporting anything unusual. Daniel, Stephen, and Paul continued backpacking together after the incident. They did not become afraid of wilderness travel. They completed trips in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Maine during the following years, but none returned to that particular section of Virginia. When friends asked why, they usually blamed the abandoned backpack. That explanation was easier. Years later, Daniel reviewed photographs from the trip while organizing old files. Most showed ordinary trail scenes, mountain overlooks, and the shelter where they spent their final night. One photograph showed the abandoned backpack beside the tree. Daniel enlarged it because something in the background looked unfamiliar. Farther up the trail, beyond the backpack, stood a narrow, pale shape between two trees. It was too distant and blurred to identify. It could have been exposed bark, sunlight striking vegetation, or another hiker partially hidden by the forest. Daniel compared the photograph with several others taken seconds apart. The pale shape appeared in only one image. He never submitted the photograph as evidence because the investigation had ended years earlier and the image proved nothing, but he remembered the white light from the previous night. He remembered the footsteps maintaining their distance through miles of forest, and he remembered something else that had seemed unimportant when the group first discovered the old backpack. Its shoulder straps had been facing the trail. The pack was not lying flat as though discarded. It rested against the tree at an angle, positioned almost upright beneath years of leaves. From a distance, Daniel realized it could have looked like someone sitting beside the trail and watching hikers pass. No one ever proved that anyone followed the three men through those mountains. Wildlife, falling branches, and unusual acoustics remain more reasonable explanations than anything extraordinary. The pale shape in the photograph remains equally uncertain, yet that uncertainty is exactly why the experience stayed with them. They had spent decades exploring remote wilderness and understood that fear could turn ordinary sounds into something threatening. They knew the safest response was usually to remain calm, observe carefully, and trust evidence rather than imagination. That afternoon, the evidence told them almost nothing. Their experience told them to leave. So, three experienced hikers abandoned a trip they had planned for months and walked 7 miles toward the nearest road, while something they could never see seemed to keep pace through the forest. They reached help safely before darkness. Whatever had been behind them never appeared. For Daniel, that remains the most disturbing part. Danger in the wilderness usually reveals itself eventually. A storm arrives, a bear steps from the trees, an injured hiker is found. A suspicious stranger finally comes around the bend. On that section of the Appalachian Trail, nothing ever did. There were only footsteps, an occasional light among the trees, an old backpack belonging to nobody investigators could identify, and mile after mile of forest separating three hikers from the nearest help. Whatever followed them never needed to come closer. It only needed them to know it was still there. In this new story, the Carter family had lived in the same narrow Appalachian hollow for nearly 12 years before anything unusual ever happened. Their weathered farmhouse rested between steep forested ridges where sunlight disappeared long before evening reached nearby towns. Only 4 other homes stood within several miles, separated by winding gravel roads and dense hardwood forests that seemed to swallow every sound after sunset. The isolation had always been part of the appeal because the family preferred quiet lives away from crowded highways and expanding suburbs. Neighbors often described the hollow as peaceful, despite its reputation among older residents who quietly admitted they avoided walking those woods after dark. Spring arrived later than expected during that particular year. Cold mornings lingered well into April, leaving thick patches of fog trapped along the valley floor until midday. The Carter family continued their daily routines without noticing anything out of place. David worked maintenance at a nearby lumber mill while his wife Karen managed the property and homeschooled their youngest daughter. Their older son often hunted turkey before sunrise, returning with stories about deer trails, black bears, and distant owls. Nothing in those conversations hinted that the family would soon become the subject of whispered discussions throughout neighboring communities. The first strange incident appeared so ordinary that nobody thought it deserved much attention. Shortly after midnight, one calm Tuesday, Karen woke because someone seemed to be slowly walking across the gravel driveway outside their bedroom window. The footsteps remained steady without rushing or hesitating. She assumed a neighbor needed help with a broken truck because emergencies sometimes happened in remote mountain communities. David pulled aside the curtain, expecting headlights or flashlights. Instead, he found only darkness stretching across the yard beneath a cloud-covered sky. The footsteps stopped the moment he looked outside, leaving complete silence behind. The following evening, everything remained perfectly normal until almost the exact same time. Again, the slow footsteps crossed the driveway. Again, they sounded close enough to identify individual stones shifting beneath heavy boots. David immediately stepped onto the porch carrying a flashlight. The beam reached the tree line without revealing anyone. Fresh dew covered the gravel, yet no footprints appeared anywhere across the driveway. The woods surrounding the farmhouse remained unusually still. Even insects seemed quieter than expected for that season, something David mentioned only after returning indoors. By the end of the week, every member of the family except the youngest daughter had heard the footsteps. Each person described the same deliberate pace. Nobody reported running, stumbling, or changing direction. Whatever produced the sound seemed to walk directly toward the front porch before stopping several feet short of the steps. Then, absolute silence followed. The family waited behind darkened windows several nights, hoping to catch whoever might be playing an elaborate prank. No figure ever appeared despite the unmistakable sound approaching the house with remarkable consistency. Weeks passed before another detail entered the story. Their closest neighbor, who lived almost 2 miles away, casually mentioned hearing someone walking outside his barn after midnight. He assumed raccoons had climbed across stored equipment until he noticed these sounds resembled measured human footsteps rather than animal movement. When David described similar experiences, the neighbor grew noticeably uncomfortable. He admitted older relatives once warned him never to investigate unexplained footsteps echoing through mountain hollows during unusually quiet nights. Those warnings came without explanations because previous generations rarely discussed such experiences openly. David dismissed the conversation as local folklore, even though the timing unsettled him. Rural Appalachian communities preserved countless stories passed through families for generations. Most involved cautionary tales meant to keep children away from abandoned mines, unstable cliffs, or unfamiliar strangers. He believed these newer rumors probably served the same purpose. Nevertheless, he installed brighter floodlights around the farmhouse and checked every window before sleeping. The lights illuminated nearly every corner of the property, making it difficult for anyone to approach unnoticed. Despite those changes, the footsteps continued exactly as before. Summer brought warmer temperatures and longer evenings. Friends visited for weekend cookouts, often staying well past sunset. Nothing unusual happened whenever guests remained outside. The strange sounds appeared only after everyone else had left and the family settled into bed. One visitor later remarked that the property felt unusually peaceful compared with neighboring valleys because almost no highway noise reached the hollow. Karen privately wondered whether that silence simply made ordinary nighttime sounds seem more disturbing. She tried convincing herself the explanation was psychological, yet every repeated incident chipped away at that confidence. One humid July night, the pattern unexpectedly changed. Instead of stopping near the porch, the footsteps slowly circled the entire farmhouse. Each family member listened while the unseen walker completed what sounded like a careful inspection around every exterior wall. Wooden boards occasionally creaked beneath invisible weight. Gravel shifted beside basement windows. Dry leaves rustled near the back entrance. David opened the rear door before the sounds reached that side of the house. Nothing stood beneath the floodlights except motionless trees swaying gently in the warm night air. Karen began recording dates and times inside a notebook. She hoped documenting each occurrence might reveal a logical pattern connected to weather, wildlife, or nearby activity. After several months, she noticed most incidents happened during calm evenings without strong wind or rain. The sounds almost never appeared during storms. They also seemed concentrated between midnight and 2 in the morning. Those observations fascinated David because they suggested consistency rather than random imagination. Still, neither explanation nor physical evidence emerged despite careful attention. In this new story, the Appalachian Mountains stretch for more than 2,000 miles across the eastern United States, passing through 14 states and thousands of small communities. Millions of people hike its trails every year without incident. Families camp beside its rivers, hunters disappear into its forests before sunrise, and retired couples spend quiet weekends driving its scenic roads. Yet, despite its popularity, there are stories that rarely appear in travel brochures or history books. They survive through sheriff reports, ranger journals, local newspapers, and conversations shared on front porches long after the sun goes down. Most of these stories are never presented as proof of anything supernatural. Instead, they are remembered because no investigation, no expert, and no witness has ever been able to explain exactly what happened. This is one of those stories. In the autumn of 2019, documentary photographer Aaron Mitchell accepted a commission from a regional history museum in North Carolina. His assignment was simple: spend 3 weeks traveling through the Appalachian Mountains, photographing abandoned schools, churches, railroad depots, and coal camps before time erased them completely. Aaron was 45 years old, meticulous, and unusually patient. He preferred working alone, often waiting hours for the right natural light before taking a single photograph. His reputation depended on accuracy, and he never embellished his experiences to make a story more interesting. Friends often joked that Aaron could spend an entire day documenting an empty building without speaking to another person. That quiet personality made what happened during his assignment even more difficult to dismiss. His journey began without incident. During the first week, he photographed abandoned mining communities across southwest Virginia before crossing into eastern Tennessee. Every evening, he uploaded his photographs, backed up his equipment, and wrote detailed notes describing each location. Those journals would later become one of the most important parts of the investigation because they documented exactly where he traveled, who he interviewed, and what he experienced each day. Nothing unusual appeared until the afternoon of October 14th, when he stopped at a nearly forgotten mountain church outside a community that no longer appeared on most modern maps. The church had been built during the early 1900s and officially closed more than 20 years earlier after the congregation became too small to maintain the property. Local volunteers still cut the grass several times each summer, but the building remained locked except during occasional historical tours. Aaron spent nearly 2 hours photographing weathered wooden pews, stained glass windows, and handwritten hymn books left inside glass display cases. Before leaving, he met an elderly volunteer named Charles Morgan, who had cared for the property for more than 15 years. Their conversation focused mainly on local history until Charles unexpectedly asked whether Aaron planned to continue driving after sunset. Aaron answered that he hoped to reach another abandoned school nearly 40 miles away before spending the night in a nearby motel. Charles paused before quietly replying, "If you're still in the mountains after dark, don't follow lights that weren't there during the day." Aaron assumed the comment referred to hunters or private property and thanked the man before continuing east. By late afternoon, clouds settled across the ridges while temperatures dropped quickly. Shortly after 7, darkness covered the mountain roads completely. Traffic became almost non-existent, leaving Aaron alone with little more than the sound of tires against damp pavement. Around 8:15, while crossing a narrow ridge, he noticed a single light glowing through the trees several hundred yards above the highway. At first, he assumed it belonged to an isolated farmhouse. Less than a minute later, another light appeared farther along the same ridgeline. Then another. Within 5 minutes, 6 separate lights stretched across the mountainside. None moved, none flickered. They remained perfectly steady despite there being no visible roads or buildings nearby. Aaron stopped at a gravel turnout to photograph the unusual sight. Through the camera's viewfinder, the lights appeared unusually bright against the dark forest. He adjusted focus several times but could not identify their source. They looked too small to be houses and too steady to be flashlights. After taking several photographs, he climbed back into his vehicle and continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, he rounded another bend and saw the exact same line of lights again, now appearing on a different mountain entirely. He checked his navigation screen to confirm he had continued east without turning around. The map showed no intersections capable of returning him to the previous overlook. Yet the pattern of lights looked identical, right down to their spacing across the ridge. The following morning, Aaron reviewed the photographs over breakfast, expecting to identify distant cabins hidden by darkness. Instead, every image showed an empty mountainside. The trees, ridges, and night sky appeared exactly as he remembered, but the lights themselves were missing. Thinking the camera had malfunctioned, he compared the digital timestamps. They confirmed the photographs had been taken during the exact period he remembered stopping beside the highway. Even stranger, his handwritten journal contained a sketch of the lights drawn immediately afterward while the memory remained fresh. Aaron rarely sketched anything unless he believed it might help identify a location later. Rather than dismissing the incident, Aaron returned to the same overlook the following evening under nearly identical weather conditions. He waited almost 3 hours. The lights never appeared. During the drive back, he stopped at a small diner where several longtime residents gathered each night after work. Curious, he casually mentioned seeing unexplained lights on the mountain. The conversation around him stopped almost immediately. Finally, an older woman seated near the window asked him a question. Were they all in a straight line? Aaron nodded. Without another word, the woman finished her coffee and quietly left the diner. No one laughed, no one offered an explanation. Instead, the owner walked over and changed the subject entirely, asking Aaron where he planned to travel next. Only after the other customers had gone did the owner explain why everyone became uncomfortable. Similar reports had circulated locally for generations. Hunters, utility workers, volunteer firefighters, and even state forestry employees occasionally described rows of steady lights appearing where no structures existed. Search teams sent to investigate never found electrical equipment, campsites, or evidence anyone had been on the ridges at all. Aaron spent the next several days researching county archives instead of photographing abandoned buildings. Inside a historical society office, he discovered newspaper clippings dating back to the 1950s describing unidentified mountain lights observed by unrelated witnesses across different decades. None of the reports claimed anything supernatural. Most suggested atmospheric conditions, distant vehicles, or optical illusions. Yet each investigation reached the same conclusion. No explanation fully matched the observations because the lights often appeared where roads had never existed. One forestry report even noted that helicopters flown over the reported locations during daylight found nothing but dense, untouched forest. When Aaron returned home, he organized the material into a presentation for the museum that had hired him. To the surprise of his colleagues, he removed every reference to the lights before the exhibit opened. Later, one curator asked why he excluded what seemed like the most interesting part of the assignment. Aaron's answer was simple. The photographs couldn't prove what I saw. The witnesses couldn't prove what they remembered. But none of us could explain it either. Years have passed since Aaron's journey through the Appalachians. The museum still displays his photographs of abandoned churches, forgotten schools, and empty coal towns. Visitors admire the images without realizing one chapter of the trip was intentionally left out. Somewhere among those mountains are ridges where experienced hunters refuse to chase distant lights after sunset, not because they believe every story they have heard, but because too many ordinary people with nothing to gain by inventing them, have described the same impossible sight for more than half a century. Perhaps there is a perfectly ordinary explanation waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps the Appalachian Mountains still keep a few stories that no one has ever been able to explain. In this new story, on August 9, 2022, the Tennessee Highway Patrol opened an investigation after receiving 3 unrelated reports involving the same stretch of U.S. play. Highway 421 near the Tennessee-Virginia border. None of the callers reported a collision, a disabled vehicle, or a crime in progress. Instead, each described encountering a dark-colored pickup truck parked along the shoulder shortly after midnight with its headlights switched off. What immediately caught investigators' attention was that every witness provided nearly identical details despite contacting dispatch separately over a period of 45 minutes. By the time the first trooper reached the reported location, the truck had disappeared. At first, investigators assumed the driver had simply continued down the highway. Over the following week, however, evidence began suggesting that the 3 motorists had not witnessed the same event at all, despite believing they had. The investigation centered on a remote section of highway crossing steep Appalachian ridges where cellular reception frequently disappeared for several miles at a time. Although the road remained well-maintained, long curves and heavy tree cover limited visibility after sunset. Traffic volume dropped significantly after 11 o'clock, leaving many drivers traveling alone for extended periods. Highway patrol records showed relatively few serious accidents in the area, making the cluster of nearly identical reports stand out immediately. Detectives began by locating the 3 motorists, all of whom agreed to provide detailed written statements before learning anything about the other reports. The first witness, a traveling nurse returning home after a weekend shift, reported passing the parked pickup at approximately 12:18 a.m. She noticed the vehicle because it appeared unusually clean for a truck sitting partially on the gravel shoulder. According to her statement, the driver's door remained closed, no interior lights were visible, and no emergency flashers had been activated. Believing the driver might need assistance, she slowed briefly before deciding not to stop because she could see no one outside the vehicle. She continued driving without giving the incident further thought until hearing about the investigation several days later. 17 minutes later, a commercial delivery driver contacted emergency dispatch after observing what he believed was the same pickup approximately 3 miles farther north. Unlike the previous witness, he recalled seeing the driver's side door standing open while the headlights remained off. He reduced speed, expecting someone to emerge from the darkness beside the road, yet no movement appeared anywhere near the truck. Dashboard camera footage from his vehicle confirmed that a pickup had indeed been parked on the shoulder, but the grainy nighttime recording failed to capture enough detail for investigators to identify the license plate or determine whether anyone had been nearby. The third report arrived shortly before 1 o'clock from a retired firefighter driving toward Bristol after visiting relatives. His description matched the previous witnesses in almost every respect except for one important detail. He insisted the pickup had been parked facing the opposite direction from normal traffic flow. Initially, investigators believed the witness had simply become disoriented while driving through the mountain curves after midnight. Accident reconstruction specialists later visited the location and determined that his description of the vehicle's orientation accurately matched physical tire marks discovered beside the highway later that morning. Troopers searched the entire section of highway before sunrise without locating the pickup. Instead, investigators found fresh tire impressions leading from the shoulder toward an abandoned gravel access road that had once served a nearby communications tower. The road ended less than half a mile later at a locked security gate overlooking a steep ravine. Officers found no vehicle beyond the gate and no evidence suggesting a truck had turned around within the narrow clearing. Drone surveys conducted after daylight confirmed there were no alternative exits, hidden trails, or recent signs of off-road travel capable of explaining where the pickup had gone. Detectives next examined surveillance footage collected from service stations, convenience stores, and highway cameras covering every possible route leading toward the reported location. Investigators expected to identify the pickup entering or leaving the area within a predictable time frame. Instead, analysts discovered that no camera captured a vehicle matching the witnesses' descriptions after approximately 11:40 p.m. before the first emergency call. Every highway connecting to the remote section had at least one functioning traffic camera, yet none recorded a dark-colored pickup during the period in question. The absence of digital evidence became one of the most difficult aspects of the investigation because it conflicted directly with 3 independent witness accounts and partial dashboard camera footage. Forensic specialists inspected the tire impressions recovered from the gravel shoulder. Measurements indicated a full-size pickup equipped with all-terrain tires, but the tracks ended abruptly where the gravel access road met exposed bedrock near the communications site. Search teams expanded their examination well beyond the immediate area, covering wooded slopes, drainage channels, and abandoned maintenance roads. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging searched throughout the following night, while officers checked nearby storage buildings and isolated cabins. No vehicle matching the descriptions was ever located. Investigators ultimately concluded that the tire impressions confirmed a truck had reached the access road, but offered no evidence explaining how it had left. Several months later, analysts completed a synchronized reconstruction using dispatch logs, vehicle telematics from the delivery truck, dashboard camera timestamps, and the responding trooper's GPS records. The reconstruction revealed an unexpected inconsistency. Based on verified travel times, the 3 motorists could not all have observed the same pickup. According to the timeline, the vehicle would have needed to travel between reported locations faster than physically possible without passing one of the witnesses who had been continuously driving the highway. Investigators carefully reviewed every timestamp multiple times before accepting the conclusion. The reports remained individually credible, yet together they described movements that could not be reconciled. The case was eventually closed after detectives exhausted every investigative lead. No missing vehicles matching the available description were reported anywhere in Tennessee or Virginia during the relevant period. No abandoned pickup was recovered in surrounding counties, and no evidence suggested that the motorists had coordinated their accounts before contacting authorities. The official report classified the incident as an unresolved suspicious circumstance rather than a criminal investigation, noting that insufficient evidence existed to identify either the vehicle or its driver. Among Highway Patrol investigators, however, the case continues to circulate during training discussions because it demonstrates how multiple reliable witness statements can sometimes reinforce one another while simultaneously making a case far more difficult to explain. For travelers who regularly drive isolated Appalachian highways after midnight, it remains one of those investigations where every documented fact appears trustworthy, yet the complete story still refuses to fit together. In this new story, there is a particular kind of silence that settles over small Appalachian towns during the final weeks of summer. By August, the days are still warm, but darkness arrives a little earlier. Porch lights appear before dinner is finished, and the forests surrounding isolated communities seem to grow larger after sunset. Most nights pass without anything worth remembering. But in August of 2019, families living along a quiet valley in Western Virginia began noticing something strange. It always happened between midnight and 3 in the morning. Nobody disappeared, no homes were broken into, and no crime was ever established. Yet before the month ended, several families had stopped sleeping upstairs, children were staying with relatives, and deputies were quietly driving the same roads every night, trying to discover who kept leaving the porch lights on at houses where nobody lived. The valley contained fewer than 40 occupied homes scattered along 7 miles of narrow road between two forested ridges. Many properties had belonged to the same families for generations. Several older houses stood empty after their owners died or moved closer to larger towns, leaving dark windows and overgrown yards between occupied residences. Everyone knew which houses were vacant. That familiarity was important because the first unusual report involved an abandoned farmhouse that had not received electricity in nearly 11 years. Shortly after 1 o'clock on August 4th, a woman living across the valley noticed its front porch light glowing steadily through the trees. She watched it for several minutes before deciding someone must have purchased the property. By morning, the light was gone. 2 days later, her husband walked to the farmhouse expecting to find contractors or signs of recent activity. The grass surrounding the building remained waist-high. A chain still secured the front gate, and fallen branches blocked part of the driveway. Through a broken basement window, he could see that the electrical meter had been removed from the exterior wall years earlier. Nothing suggested anyone had entered the property. He mentioned the light to a neighbor who immediately described seeing something similar at another vacant house farther north during the previous night. That house had been empty since a fire damaged its kitchen 5 years earlier. Its porch light had also appeared shortly after midnight. The neighbors initially treated the incidents as an odd coincidence. Reflections from passing vehicles could create convincing illusions along the valley, especially when humid summer air settled close to the ground. That explanation became harder to accept after a third light appeared. On August 9th, a retired school teacher woke shortly before 2 in the morning and noticed a bright yellow glow outside her bedroom window. An abandoned cottage stood across the road approximately 100 yards from her property. Its porch was illuminated clearly enough that she could see the railing and front steps. She watched from her window for nearly 15 minutes. No vehicle approached, nobody crossed the yard. Then the light switched off instantly. The following morning, she contacted the county sheriff's office. A deputy inspected the cottage and discovered that the electrical service had been disconnected 8 years earlier. The porch fixture still contained an old bulb, but wiring inside the wall had deteriorated badly enough that an electrician later confirmed it could not have operated normally. There were no footprints around the building and no signs of forced entry. The deputy considered the possibility of someone using a battery-powered lamp positioned behind the fixture as a prank, but removing the glass cover revealed years of dirt and insects that appeared completely undisturbed. The incident was documented and initially classified as suspicious activity. During the next week, the report spread along the valley. 5 vacant houses were involved, each separated by significant distance. Residents consistently described only one illuminated porch at a time. The light usually appeared after midnight and remained visible for several minutes before disappearing. Nobody reported seeing lights inside the houses themselves. Nobody saw vehicles parked nearby. More importantly, the sequence seemed to move gradually north. The first report came from the southern end of the valley. Each later sighting occurred at another abandoned property farther along the same road. By August 15th, deputies realized the next vacant house in that direction stood directly beside an occupied home containing a family with 2 young children. Rather than waiting for another report, 2 deputies parked their patrol vehicles away from the road and watched the property overnight. They arrived before 11 and inspected the abandoned house while daylight remained. Every door was secured, every room was empty, and the porch light had no functioning electrical connection. One deputy positioned himself in woodland overlooking the front entrance, while the second remained inside an unmarked vehicle farther down the road. For almost 3 hours, nothing happened. Then, At 1:38 a.m., the deputy in the woods radioed that the porch had become illuminated. The second deputy reached the house in less than a minute. By then, the light had disappeared. Both officers searched the building and surrounding property using flashlights and thermal equipment. They found no person. The doors remained locked, windows remained secured, and vegetation surrounding the porch showed no evidence that anyone had recently walked through it. The officer who witnessed the light was certain it had originated near the porch ceiling rather than from passing headlights. His body camera had been operating throughout the observation, but the house stood near the edge of the recording's visible range. The footage showed a faint increase in brightness for approximately 40 seconds before darkness returned. It could not identify the source. The sheriff's office increased overnight patrols without publicly discussing the pattern. Investigators worried that publicity might encourage copycats and make the original activity impossible to separate from pranks. Meanwhile, residents began changing their routines. Some closed curtains before sunset, others installed motion lights and cameras. Several families began leaving dogs indoors overnight. The atmosphere throughout the valley changed despite nothing openly threatening having occurred. People were not frightened because someone had attacked them. They were frightened because something appeared to be moving slowly from one abandoned house to the next, and nobody knew what would happen when there were no empty houses left. On August 19th, that question became more difficult to ignore. The next property north had been abandoned only temporarily. Its owner, an 80-year-old widower, was recovering from surgery at his daughter's home several counties away. A neighbor watching the property noticed the porch light illuminated at 2:06 a.m. and immediately contacted deputies. Officers arrived while the light was still visible from the road. According to the incident report, it disappeared as the first patrol vehicle entered the driveway. Deputies searched the house and found nothing disturbed. Unlike the earlier properties, this home still had active electricity. Examination of the security system showed something unexpected. The porch light switch inside the locked house had physically moved into the on position. The homeowner insisted he had switched every exterior light off before leaving. Investigators could not prove otherwise. There was no smart home system, timer, or remote control connected to the fixture. Someone inside the house could easily have operated the switch, yet cameras installed at neighboring properties showed no person approaching or leaving during the relevant period. Doors showed no evidence of tampering. Windows remained locked from inside. Nothing was stolen. The incident provided the first clear evidence that the phenomenon might involve actual human interference, but it simultaneously made that possibility harder to understand. 3 nights passed without another light. Residents began hoping the strange sequence had ended. Then, shortly after midnight on August 23rd, something entirely different happened. A family living near the northern end of the valley woke to their front porch, light turning on. Their house was occupied. The father checked the hallway and confirmed everyone was inside. He walked toward the front room, expecting an electrical problem. Before reaching the door, he noticed a shadow moving across the curtains from outside. It passed slowly from one side of the porch to the other and stopped near the front steps. He immediately moved his family into an upstairs bedroom and contacted emergency dispatch. Deputies arrived 7 minutes later. The porch light remained on. Nobody was outside. Fresh mud covered part of the yard after an afternoon storm, yet no footprints approached the porch from the road or surrounding forest. Investigators searched beneath the house, behind nearby sheds, and along the creek bordering the property. Nothing was found. A motion-activated camera mounted above the garage had recorded the entire front yard. At 12:17 a.m., the porch light activated. Approximately 9 seconds later, the camera briefly adjusted its exposure as though something had moved close to the porch. No person appeared anywhere in the recording. The light remained on until the homeowner eventually switched it off after deputies completed their search. That became the final incident reported during August. The sheriff's office continued patrols through September, but no additional porch lights appeared unexpectedly. Investigators examined electrical systems at several affected properties, interviewed residents, reviewed camera recordings, and searched for connections between previous owners. Nothing produced a convincing explanation. The abandoned houses belonged to unrelated families, their electrical conditions varied significantly. Some had functioning wiring, while others had been disconnected from the grid for years. There was no evidence linking the incidents to trespassers, teenagers, former residents, or anyone living nearby. Years later, several of the abandoned houses were demolished or renovated. New families moved into two properties without reporting anything unusual. The valley returned to the quiet routine it had known before that summer. Children grew older, residents moved away, and many people stopped discussing what happened. Yet, those who lived there during August 2019 still remember the order in which the lights appeared. One house after another, always moving north, always after midnight, always illuminating a porch where nobody should have been standing. The strangest detail was discovered much later when a retired deputy reviewed his notes while preparing old records for storage. He plotted every affected property on a county map and noticed something investigators had overlooked during the original response. The houses were not merely arranged from south to north. Each successive property stood almost exactly the same distance farther along the road. When the final occupied house was added to the sequence, the pattern formed a steady progression through the valley, as though something had been stopping at one porch every few nights before continuing toward the next. There should have been one more stop. Less than a mile beyond the final house stood another abandoned property hidden behind trees at the northern edge of the valley. Investigators had never included it because no unusual activity was reported there. When the retired deputy checked historical property records, he discovered why. The house had been demolished on August 22nd, one day before the porch light appeared at the occupied family's home instead. Nobody has ever established whether that timing meant anything. No official report describes the incidents as paranormal, and everyone involved accepts that an ordinary explanation may still exist. But for the families who spent those quiet August nights watching lights move slowly closer through the mountains, one question remains difficult to forget. If that last abandoned house had still been standing, would the light have stopped there instead? In this new story, on July 26, 2019, emergency responders were dispatched to a narrow stretch of State Route 16 in southern West Virginia after several passing motorists reported finding an abandoned pickup truck resting against a roadside guardrail. The collision itself appeared minor. The airbags had not deployed, the windshield remained intact, and investigators found no evidence suggesting another vehicle had been involved. What immediately concerned deputies was the complete absence of the driver. The truck's engine was still warm when the first deputy arrived, the headlights remained on, and the driver's wallet, cell phone, and vehicle keys were all found inside the cab. Under ordinary circumstances, investigators expected to locate the driver somewhere nearby within a matter of minutes. Instead, the search developed into one of the most unusual missing person investigations the county had handled in years. The truck belonged to 43-year-old Michael Turner, an electrical contractor from Beckley who had spent the afternoon inspecting power equipment at several rural substations following severe summer storms earlier that week. Company records confirmed he completed his final inspection shortly after 8 o'clock before beginning the 70-minute drive home. GPS records taken from his work tablet showed nothing unusual during most of the journey. He stopped briefly at a gas station, purchased coffee, and continued north along the same highway he had driven dozens of times before. Security cameras showed him leaving alone. Nothing in his behavior suggested confusion, distress, or any intention of changing his route. Deputies began searching the immediate area under the assumption that Turner had been injured and wandered into the surrounding woods seeking help. Volunteer firefighters, tracking teams, thermal imaging drones, and canine units spent the remainder of the night examining nearly 3 miles of steep forest surrounding the crash site. Fresh tire marks confirmed the pickup had gradually drifted onto the shoulder before striking the guardrail at relatively low speed. There were no signs of sudden braking, evasive steering, or mechanical failure. More puzzling still, investigators found only a single set of footprints leading away from the driver's door. Those tracks continued for approximately 80 yards before ending abruptly on a patch of exposed rock where tracking dogs lost the scent entirely. During the following morning, accident reconstruction specialists examined the vehicle in greater detail. They found no evidence of intoxication, medical distress, or equipment failure. The truck contained unopened groceries, work documents neatly organized on the passenger seat, and a cooler holding medication Turner was expected to take that evening. His wedding ring remained on the center console after he had apparently removed it while working earlier that day, a habit his wife later confirmed. Everything inside the truck suggested a man expecting to arrive home within the hour. Nothing suggested someone preparing to disappear voluntarily. Investigators next focused on Turner's digital activity. His mobile phone had stopped transmitting only moments before deputies arrived, but technicians recovered location data covering the final 30 minutes of his drive. The information revealed something unexpected. Although the truck had remained on State Route 16, the phone's internal compass repeatedly registered abrupt directional changes inconsistent with the road itself. Analysts initially suspected a software error until identical anomalies appeared in data collected from Turner's dashboard navigation system. Whatever caused the irregular readings affected two independent devices operating through different sensors. Engineers were unable to reproduce the malfunction during later testing. As search operations expanded, detectives interviewed motorists who had driven the same stretch of highway that evening. Most remembered nothing unusual beyond the abandoned pickup. One witness, however, provided a timeline that complicated the investigation. Traveling approximately 15 minutes behind Turner, she recalled passing the same white pickup twice within less than 10 minutes, despite remaining on the same road without making any turns. Investigators verified her route using toll records and fuel receipts. According to every available record, she could not have encountered the same vehicle twice unless one of the two timelines was incorrect. Yet, surveillance footage from a convenience store confirmed the time she entered the highway matched her statement almost exactly. State police analysts reviewed traffic cameras from neighboring counties, hoping to establish Turner's complete route. Every camera showed the pickup exactly where investigators expected until the final 12-mile section approaching the crash site. No cameras covered that stretch of road directly, leaving investigators to reconstruct events using witness statements, digital records, and estimated travel times. The resulting timeline contained an unexplained gap of nearly 26 minutes. Based on the distance involved, Turner should have reached the crash location long before emergency calls were placed. No evidence explained where he had been during those missing minutes. Search teams remained in the area for 12 consecutive days. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras surveyed nearby ridgelines, dive teams searched ponds and abandoned quarry pits. Hundreds of volunteers walked carefully spaced grid patterns across dense woodland. Despite covering more than 1,800 acres, investigators recovered nothing beyond the original footprints ending on exposed stone. The absence of additional physical evidence gradually shifted attention away from the surrounding forest and toward the unanswered questions contained within the timeline itself. Several months later, forensic analysts completed a detailed examination of the pickup's onboard computer. Among thousands of ordinary vehicle records, technicians discovered that every electronic system inside the truck had briefly lost synchronized time shortly before the collision. The discrepancy lasted only 43 seconds before correcting automatically. Individually, such errors occasionally occurred in modern vehicles. What attracted investigators' attention was that Turner's phone, work tablet, and dashboard navigation system all recorded nearly the same unexplained interruption within the same minute. Specialists from both the vehicle manufacturer and the software companies involved agreed on only one point. They had never encountered identical timing anomalies across four independent electronic systems operating simultaneously. The investigation officially remains open. Michael Turner has never been located, and no evidence has emerged indicating he intentionally disappeared or became the victim of a known crime. His truck still sits inside a secured evidence facility, preserved because investigators believe advances in digital forensics may someday explain details that current technology cannot. The official case file concludes with a straightforward assessment stating that the available evidence is insufficient to determine what occurred during the final half hour of Turner's journey. For the detectives who worked the investigation, however, the unanswered questions begin much earlier than the crash itself. They begin with the missing 26 minutes, a routine drive home, and one of the darkest July nights the county has ever tried to explain. In this new story, in September of 2022, the West Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police hosted its annual investigative conference in Charleston. Among presentations covering homicide investigations, search and rescue operations, and digital forensics, one session attracted unusual attention despite involving no confirmed crime. The presentation examined a series of unexplained incidents reported over nearly 3 decades by residents of small mountain towns scattered across Appalachia. None of the cases resulted in arrests, none involved identifiable suspects, and none were officially classified as criminal investigations. What connected them was something far more unusual. In every case, experienced investigators concluded that the available evidence supported the witnesses' accounts far more than anyone had initially expected. The first file discussed during the conference originated in Clay County, West Virginia, during November 2016. Shortly after 6 o'clock on a cold Friday evening, the owner of a family-operated hardware store contacted local deputies after discovering the business unlocked despite having personally secured it less than an hour earlier. Nothing appeared to be missing. Cash remained inside the register, expensive power tools were untouched, and surveillance cameras continued recording normally throughout the evening. Deputies initially believed an employee had accidentally returned after closing. Instead, the surveillance footage showed the front door unlocking from the inside without anyone appearing on camera. Investigators reviewed the recording repeatedly, confirming there had been no interruption, digital corruption, or evidence of tampering. The door opened slowly, remained open for approximately 20 seconds, then closed again without a single person entering or leaving the building. Forensic technicians examined the property the following morning, expecting to identify a mechanical malfunction or signs of forced entry overlooked during the initial response. The electronic lock functioned perfectly during testing, fingerprints recovered from both door handles belonged exclusively to employees, and alarm records confirmed the security system had never been deactivated. More surprisingly, investigators determined that the locking mechanism could not physically disengage unless activated either from inside the building or through an authorized access code. The owner confirmed no employee possessed remote access, while security contractors verified that no system errors had been recorded that evening. The investigation concluded without identifying how the door had opened, leaving detectives with evidence that clearly documented the event but failed to explain it. The second investigation came from a small community in eastern Kentucky during August 2018 after volunteer firefighters responded to repeated reports of lights appearing inside a long-abandoned elementary school scheduled for demolition. Residents living nearby insisted the lights appeared only briefly before disappearing again, often after midnight when no authorized workers remained on the property. Responding firefighters entered the building expecting to find trespassers. Instead, they found every classroom empty, windows secured, and electrical service disconnected months earlier. Utility records later confirmed no power had reached the building since the previous winter. Investigators considered portable generators or battery-powered lighting, yet exhaustive searches recovered nothing capable of producing the illumination described by multiple witnesses over several consecutive nights. Unlike rumors that often circulate through small communities, the reports from the abandoned school came from individuals who had little connection to one another. Statements were collected independently from delivery drivers, overnight highway maintenance workers, neighboring homeowners, and a deputy sheriff patrolling the surrounding roads. Each described lights appearing behind second-floor classroom windows before disappearing moments later. Traffic cameras positioned several blocks away failed to capture the phenomenon because the building sat beyond their field of view, leaving investigators dependent upon witness testimony supported only by repeated, unsuccessful searches. After nearly 2 weeks, the reports stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and demolition crews removed the structure later that autumn without discovering evidence that anyone had been occupying the building. The final case examined during the conference began in a mountain town along the Virginia border during January 2020. County Emergency Dispatch received several calls reporting that church bells were ringing shortly after 3 o'clock on consecutive winter mornings, despite the church itself having been closed for nearly 6 months while undergoing structural repairs. Maintenance contractors confirmed that the bell tower's electrical controls had been disconnected during renovation work and remained inoperable throughout the project. Deputies responding to the church found locked entrances, undisturbed snow surrounding the building, and no indication that anyone had entered the property overnight. Audio specialists later inspected the bell mechanism, concluding that it could not have operated without electrical power or direct mechanical force. No evidence supporting either explanation was ever found. Investigators reviewing the 3 incidents several years later noted that each initially appeared simple enough to resolve within hours. An unlocked store suggested burglary. Lights inside an abandoned school suggested trespassing. Church bells ringing before dawn suggested vandalism. Yet every investigation gradually moved away from those ordinary assumptions as physical evidence refused to support them. Surveillance systems functioned correctly, forensic examinations revealed no signs of criminal activity, and independent witness statements remained remarkably consistent throughout each inquiry. Rather than producing dramatic conclusions, investigators repeatedly found themselves eliminating one practical explanation after another until only the documented facts remained. During the conference discussion, veteran detectives emphasized an important distinction often overlooked by the public. None of the official case files described paranormal events, and none encouraged supernatural conclusions. Instead, the reports documented situations in which observable events occurred without leaving sufficient evidence to identify a conventional cause. Experienced investigators considered that distinction essential because unresolved cases demand caution rather than speculation. Even so, many acknowledged that these incidents remained memorable precisely because they resisted ordinary investigative methods despite careful documentation and extensive follow-up. Today, the 3 files remain archived within their respective county agencies, each carrying administrative classifications that simply identify the investigations as closed without resolution. The communities where the incidents occurred have largely returned to ordinary life, with new businesses replacing old storefronts, schools giving way to vacant lots, and church renovations long since completed. Yet among retired deputies, volunteer firefighters, and investigators who personally worked those cases, the stories continue to surface during conversations about the investigations that proved the most difficult to forget. Not because they revealed something supernatural, but because they demonstrated that even in the quietest Appalachian mountain towns, there are still cases where every available fact can be verified, every witness can be believed, and the truth can remain permanently out of reach. Strange things happened on our June road trip after midnight. Deep in the remote stretches of the Texas Hill Country, a routine nocturnal drive became a completely unexplainable, terrifying nightmare. During the incredibly humid summer of 2022, young travelers encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What regional law enforcement eventually uncovered entirely completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific rural desert community forever. Archived notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunt state police today. 28-year-old David Miller worked as a dedicated corporate accountant, simply trying to relocate his small family safely. His capable traveling partner was a 26-year-old freelance photographer named Lisa, who actively documented rural historical landscapes. Their primary summer objective required them to drive safely across the desolate Texas wilderness, far away from heavily congested interstates. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unstable, dangerous sinkholes forming throughout that exact rural region. They arrived on June 14th and immediately began carefully plotting their specific nocturnal driving route near a dark limestone canyon. The first quiet, extremely hot evening passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted travelers drove steadily onward. State records confirm that severe, scattered desert thunderstorms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation, despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Lisa woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy scraping sounds echoing near the steep, dusty ridge. She initially assumed a curious, heavy desert animal was aggressively investigating their suddenly stalling vehicle near the rocky, jagged roadside. When she cautiously looked directly outside, the heavy metallic scraping sounds instantly ceased in the hot, oppressive summer nocturnal darkness. David quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive deep indentations in the dusty soil the following heavily foggy morning. The strange, unexplainable deep tracks were perfectly circular in shape, and they sank nearly 5 inches into the solid dirt. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial mining outfit operated illegally nearby, but investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors. David carefully photographed the bizarre, dusty, massive footprints and noted that the stride length indicated a massive, heavy industrial machine. He calmly, rationally theorized that some unknown automated logging equipment might have dangerously crossed their remote territory completely unexpectedly overnight. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark night when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. Both dedicated travelers immediately started coughing violently and aggressively, struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed heavy vehicle cabin. Lisa quickly grabbed her portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional ranger station during that month. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid asphalt ground and partially cracked their rigid windshield frame. David scrambled frantically out the dark open door and desperately aimed his high-powered thermal imaging camera directly pointing upward. The glowing digital screen instantly revealed an enormous, intense heat signature standing perfectly still behind a large dead oak tree. The strange glowing thermal image lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient background radiation thermal signatures. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing bright anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Morning light clearly revealed that their specialized digital navigation equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless, broken, jagged pieces. David frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to abandon their remaining travel gear and hike toward the main rural highway. Lisa completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized their backup analog compasses were constantly displaying completely erratic, unexplainable magnetic headings. They were effectively hopelessly, completely lost in a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced, rugged survivalists. The desperate, anxious travelers decided to blindly, consistently follow the slow, dusty trail, hoping it safely intersected a paved road. They hiked for 12 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched closely behind. Archived notes from Lisa stated she repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly entirely nearby. Every single time she abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes instantly, completely vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced them to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected makeshift camp by the car. They huddled tightly, safely together by a small, warm fire while strongly clutching their sturdy walking sticks for necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense desert suddenly fell totally dead silent as wild insects stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath their heavy boots. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Texas region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. David frantically aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his thermal camera, but the expensive digital battery exploded. Lisa screamed out loudly in absolute sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped into the firelight. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly aggressively attack them, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly directly ahead. David slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange flare gun, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly extinguished the warm, bright campfire flames. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness, the two terrified close friends blindly, frantically ran into the treacherous, thorny desert. They hopelessly, blindly sprinted continuously through the dense, tangled brush until they eventually physically separated from each other completely forever. A commercial desert survey operator miraculously, happily found Lisa wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel public access channel. The young, traumatized photographer was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by sharp, jagged cactuses. State records confirm she was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly chemically treated properly. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned vehicle, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel car doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. David was tragically completely never seen again, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional search effort spanning 3 adjacent dry counties. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely entirely lost his distinct individual scent trail near the steep edge of rocky cliffs. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing accountant accidentally fatally fell into the massive, dark, hidden sinkhole. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy vehicle equipment was completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally, officially unsolved. Lisa completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising freelance rural photography career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, crowded city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark desert experiences. She eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs routinely, regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark Texas hill country deserts remain mostly, completely, thoroughly uncharted and deeply, heavily feared by many veteran guides. Experienced local rural tour operators actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice tourists from widely exploring that specific area. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual total highly accurate number of missing persons cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously completely venture into the dark region, hoping to finally capture definitive evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Lisa. The destroyed, shattered digital thermal camera conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant heat signature. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archive notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet, the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown massive desert animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying Texas desert case. The completely destroyed vehicle remains permanently locked securely inside a heavily guarded regional police evidence facility building completely indefinitely today. The thick steel chassis is completely severely warped and violently twisted in ways that heavily confuse professional, licensed structural engineers. They absolutely cannot logically, mathematically explain the immense localized heat signatures required to permanently warp such durable, thick commercial steel. The strange chemical residue carefully extracted from the melted doors completely lacks any known, recognizable, earthly, scientific, periodic table components. Law enforcement officials strongly, silently, actively discourage any independent laboratory scientists from officially testing the highly unusual toxic chemical samples. The specific isolated stretch of rural, unmarked desert highway remains completely officially closed to all civilian commercial traffic passing today. Heavy concrete barricades severely, completely restrict access to the dusty, dark path where the terrified couple originally became lost. Dispatch logs occasionally record highly unusual frantic phone calls from nearby rural ranchers complaining about strange bright nightly skylights. The massive glowing orbs reportedly silently hover directly above the completely restricted desert area before rapidly shooting straight vertically upward. Investigators never confirmed these extremely bizarre, localized aerial phenomena and simply quickly dismissed them as common military night training flares. Lisa constantly refuses to leave her highly secure concrete urban apartment whenever the hot summer season slowly, inevitably descends annually. She strictly, violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely, completely fastened throughout the entire long, dark night. She passionately, completely believes the towering, pale entities are still aggressively, constantly searching for her across the vast, expansive country. Her intense, ongoing, severe psychological therapy sessions carefully attempt to slowly, rationally dismantle her deeply ingrained, absolute paranoid mental delusions, the actual, absolute, terrifying truth hiding deep within that desolate Texas desert wilderness might never be completely, fully mathematically understood. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely safely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered. The county file from 2009 explicitly severely warns travelers to completely avoid driving completely alone during dark nights. State records clearly, consistently, actively document a highly disturbing pattern of unexplainable, strange disappearances occurring specifically during extremely hot Junes. The highly dedicated professional regional search teams completely, entirely refuse to officially patrol that specific dark sector after sunset arrives. What people continually reported seeing out there in the massive dark desert still completely, definitively, genuinely makes absolute zero sense. The completely bizarre, tragic Texas desert incident remains a highly popular, terrifying discussion topic on obscure internet online mystery forums. Amateur online sleuths constantly aggressively debate the various conflicting official reports while desperately searching for any hidden, logical, factual clues. Some highly dedicated researchers actively cross-reference these strange coordinate locations with deeply buried historical, indigenous, regional dark folklore stories. They firmly, completely believe the ancient native tribes genuinely knew exactly what terrifying entities lurked inside those specific dark canyons. However, local authorities absolutely strictly prohibit anyone from actively organizing dangerous, large-scale civilian search parties within that restricted region. The quiet, peaceful illusion of a totally harmless, relaxing summer road trip was completely, permanently shattered for that young family. Lisa completely isolated herself from all her remaining worried friends and slowly became a highly reclusive, paranoid urban apartment hermit. She constantly, frequently stares blankly out her heavily locked, reinforced apartment window while quietly listening for any heavy mechanical vibrations. Her completely tragic, deeply terrifying story serves as a highly dark, severe warning for any overly adventurous, naive young travelers. The absolute darkest, unseen, deepest corners of the harsh, remote American environment heavily conceal truly dangerous, unexplainable, ancient, predatory anomalies. The new house seemed perfect until we heard someone upstairs. Deep within the historic suburban neighborhoods of Savannah, a young married couple purchased their beautiful colonial dream home. During the humid autumn of 2020, they completely renovated the massive historic wooden structure very carefully. What actually happened during their very first night indoors completely defies any basic, logical, modern scientific explanation today. Archived notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of terrifying late-night events. 32-year-old Liam worked as a highly dedicated structural architect designing complex commercial office buildings daily. His highly capable wife was a 30-year-old financial accountant named Chloe, who frequently worked remotely indoors. Their primary professional goal required them to quickly establish a quiet, comfortable domestic life away from noisy apartments. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual trespassing complaints regarding this exact property. They officially arrived on October 12th and immediately began carefully unpacking their heavy cardboard boxes in the parlor. The first quiet afternoon passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted couple arranged their furniture. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and dropping temperatures for that entire dark night. However, Chloe woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy footsteps echoing above their ceiling. She initially assumed a large, heavy animal was aggressively exploring the completely unfinished, dusty, wooden, dark, hidden attic. When she cautiously listened closer, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps instantly ceased completely in the cold, oppressive, silent house. Liam quickly discovered a highly bizarre, locked, heavy wooden door blocking the narrow hallway leading toward the stairs. The strange, unexplainable, heavy door was perfectly solid, and it featured 3 massive modern steel deadbolts installed backwards. Some locals claimed a rogue, eccentric previous owner actively hid dangerous structural damage behind heavily reinforced wooden barricades. Investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors and strictly maintained the property was entirely structurally safe generally. Liam carefully photographed the bizarre locked barricade and noted that the surrounding drywall showed extreme signs of stress. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. Both dedicated homeowners immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed bedroom. Liam quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional police department then. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and violently rattled the thick windows. Liam scrambled frantically toward the dark hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the stair banister. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal, bright ambient light entirely. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Chloe frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to completely abandon their newly purchased historic home and run outside. Liam completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized the main electrical breaker panel was constantly displaying erratic sparks. They were effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving structural maze known for permanently confusing, highly experienced contractors. The desperate, anxious architect decided to blindly, violently run toward the front door, hoping to retrieve his keys. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark living room until he eventually physically discovered the entrance. Liam remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid wooden couch while intensely listening for aggressive movements. Archive notes from Liam stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, they vanished. Utter physical mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position. He huddled tightly, safely, against the heavy metal radiator while strongly clutching a heavy steel flashlight for protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense house suddenly fell totally dead silent entirely, completely. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath floorboards. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Savannah region, but geologists officially found nothing. Liam frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant hallway with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced door, but simply stood motionless completely. Liam slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel flashlight tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness inside the house, the terrified young couple blindly, frantically crawled desperately. They hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, locked basement room until the early morning sunlight arrived. A commercial utility repair operator miraculously happily found the rural property completely devastated near the heavily designated street. The highly traumatized young couple was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations from glass. State records confirm they were quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden interior doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal hinges twisted. Liam was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience despite the massive, highly coordinated psychological support. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep property edge. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing couple accidentally, entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive entity. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel locks were completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Chloe completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising financial accounting career and rapidly moved to a highly bustling city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable house experiences. She eventually, quietly, safely, wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs routinely, regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated suburban Savannah house remains mostly completely, thoroughly abandoned and deeply, heavily feared by residents. Experienced local rural real estate agents actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice buyers from exploring acreage. Official public-state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing trespasser cases strictly linked. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally, dangerously completely, venture into the dark, unmarked house hoping for evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with unsettling stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who believe. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily transformed archived notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented leak, yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth, melted door frames remains. University, biology, science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown anomaly. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive biological population of large hidden creatures leaves evidence. No unusual biological organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively positively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to protect operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying case. In this new story, every July, millions of Americans leave home believing the most dangerous part of their vacation will be heavy traffic, bad weather, or a flat tire somewhere along an unfamiliar highway. Most return with photographs, souvenirs, and stories they'll happily tell for years. Others return with experiences they rarely mention, not because no one would believe them, but because they still cannot explain what happened. Over the last 4 decades, sheriff departments, state police agencies, and local newspapers across the United States have quietly documented dozens of unusual reports connected to July road trips. None were ever officially linked together. Different states, different highways, different families. Yet investigators reviewing the records years later noticed something unsettling. Every witness insisted their trip changed forever after making one decision they believed was completely ordinary. The first case began during the second week of July 2015. Robert and Lisa Campbell had spent nearly 6 months planning a 2-week road trip from Missouri to Yellowstone National Park. Both were recently retired school teachers who preferred scenic back roads over busy interstates. Their travel journal, recovered months later by relatives, documented nearly every stop along the journey, including restaurants, fuel receipts, hiking trails, and conversations with local residents. It would eventually become one of the most detailed records investigators had available. On July 10th, shortly after leaving eastern Wyoming, the couple stopped at a small family-owned diner where another customer suggested a little-known scenic highway that crossed hundreds of miles of open prairie before reconnecting with the interstate farther north. According to him, the drive offered spectacular sunsets and almost no traffic. Robert marked the route inside his paper atlas before thanking the man. Security footage later confirmed the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No one ever identified the traveler who recommended the road. The first 100 miles were exactly as promised. Endless grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, while the evening sun painted the horizon deep shades of orange and gold. Robert stopped several times to photograph abandoned barns, windmills, and grazing antelope. Lisa continued writing inside her travel journal, describing the highway as one of the quietest roads they had ever driven. Shortly before sunset, she noted something unusual. They had not passed another moving vehicle for nearly 40 minutes, despite traveling during the busiest vacation month of the year. Around 8:30, they reached a weathered service station standing alone beside the highway. Its fuel pumps had been removed years earlier, but the building itself appeared occupied. An elderly woman sweeping the front porch smiled and asked whether they were heading north. When Robert answered yes, she quietly suggested they continue driving until reaching the interstate without stopping again, regardless of what they might see along the road. Lisa later wrote the warning in her journal, adding that the woman refused to explain further before wishing them a safe trip. It seemed like an odd conversation, but neither considered it especially important at the time. Just after darkness settled across the prairie, Robert noticed headlights appearing several miles behind them. The vehicle never seemed to get closer, despite maintaining exactly the same speed for nearly 20 minutes. Whenever Robert slowed slightly, the distant headlights slowed as well. When he accelerated, they accelerated too. Curious, he eventually pulled onto the shoulder, expecting the other driver to pass. Instead, the headlights stopped almost half a mile away and remained perfectly still. After waiting several minutes, Robert returned to the highway. The distant lights resumed, following at exactly the same distance. They reached the interstate shortly before 10 and immediately noticed the headlights disappear. Relieved, they continued toward Billings without discussing the incident further. The following morning, while reviewing photographs from the previous evening, Lisa discovered something unexpected. One image captured during sunset clearly showed the highway stretching behind their vehicle for several miles. There were no headlights anywhere on the road. The timestamp matched the exact period when both insisted another vehicle had been following them. Photography specialists later confirmed the image showed no signs of digital alteration. The second case occurred 3 years later during July 2018 in northern Maine. Brothers Kevin and Thomas Riley planned a fishing trip near the Canadian border. Their route crossed long stretches of forest where gas stations became increasingly rare after sunset. Shortly after 9, they stopped at a lonely convenience store to buy coffee and ask about the quickest route to their rented cabin. The cashier looked toward the parking lot before asking whether they had seen an older green station wagon parked outside. Both brothers turned toward the windows. The parking lot contained only their pickup truck. When they answered no, the cashier quietly apologized and changed the subject. Less than an hour later, Kevin noticed an older green station wagon parked beside the highway with its hood raised. Assuming someone needed assistance, he slowed almost to a stop. Before either brother could open the doors, another pickup traveling in the opposite direction repeatedly flashed its headlights. The driver leaned out his window and shouted only 3 words, "Keep driving now." Kevin accelerated without hesitation. When they glanced back through the rear window, less than 30 seconds later, the station wagon had disappeared. The shoulder where it had been parked stretched empty beneath the moonlight. State police later confirmed no disabled vehicles were reported anywhere along that section of highway that evening. The final case came from southern West Virginia during July 2022. Emily Foster, a travel nurse from North Carolina, accepted a temporary assignment in Charleston and decided to spend several days exploring small Appalachian towns before beginning work. Unlike the previous witnesses, Emily carried a dashboard camera recording continuously throughout the trip. Shortly after entering an isolated mountain highway, she encountered a handwritten detour sign directing traffic away from ongoing bridge repairs. The route eventually led through a nearly abandoned coal community where every storefront appeared empty except one small grocery store still displaying fresh produce outside the entrance. Emily purchased bottled water, spoke briefly with the elderly owner, and continued driving. The receipt recovered from her wallet showed the purchase occurred at 4:23 that afternoon. 3 weeks later, curious about the unusual town, Emily attempted to revisit the grocery store while returning home. She never found it. Local residents insisted no grocery had operated there for nearly 15 years. Historical records later confirmed the building had been destroyed during a flood long before Emily claimed to have stopped there. Even more puzzling, the bottled water she purchased remained inside her vehicle, bearing the faded store label investigators could not match to any currently registered business in West Virginia. The receipt identified a tax registration number belonging to a company officially dissolved in 2016. No explanation accounted for how she obtained either item. Years later, a transportation researcher comparing unusual travel reports noticed an unexpected connection linking all three cases. None involved violence, none resulted in disappearances. Every traveler returned home safely, yet each witness received an unexplained warning from a stranger shortly before experiencing something investigators could never verify. The warnings differed only slightly. Keep driving, don't stop, stay on the highway, reach the interstate before dark. No official investigation ever determined why those warnings appeared so consistently across different states separated by thousands of miles. Perhaps they meant nothing at all. Or perhaps every July, somewhere along America's loneliest highways, ordinary travelers unknowingly pass through places where experienced locals understand one simple rule far better than any map ever could. What hikers reported deep in the wilderness still doesn't make sense. In late summer of 2011, several unrelated hikers reported nearly identical experiences deep within a remote section of western North Carolina. Their accounts were recorded months apart, yet many details appeared unusually consistent. Dispatch logs, archived ranger notes, and later witness interviews preserved fragments of those reports, though investigators never reached a conclusion that satisfied everyone involved. One of the earliest reports came from Corbin Voss, a 37-year-old survey technician from Tennessee who spent weekends hiking remote trails. He entered the Pisgah region alone during a 3-day backpacking trip and planned to document several abandoned logging routes. According to trail records, he checked in at a ranger station shortly after sunrise and appeared calm before beginning his hike. Weather conditions remained stable throughout the day, and no warnings had been issued for that section of forest. Corbin covered nearly 12 miles before establishing camp near a narrow ridge overlooking a heavily wooded valley. He later stated that nothing unusual occurred until shortly after dusk, when distant sounds began echoing through the trees. At first, he assumed another group occupied a nearby campsite, though no fires or lights appeared anywhere below him. The sounds reportedly resembled brief conversations carried by wind, yet every attempt to identify their source failed. Around 10 that evening, Corbin heard what he believed were footsteps approaching from the eastern side of camp. The movement stopped whenever he shined his flashlight toward the trees. Several minutes later, the same pattern repeated from a different direction. He described the experience in a written statement submitted after returning home. According to archive notes, he eventually remained awake until dawn because the sounds continued at irregular intervals. The following morning revealed no obvious explanation. Corbin found no footprints near his campsite, despite damp soil that should have preserved tracks clearly. He also noticed something that later became important during the investigation. Several small stones had been arranged beside the trail leading away from camp. The formation appeared deliberate, though investigators later suggested natural causes could not be ruled out. Corbin photographed the stones before continuing his hike deeper into the wilderness. Approximately 4 months later, a second report emerged from a woman named Tessa Crowley, a 42-year-old physical therapist from Virginia. She visited the same general region while training for a long-distance hiking event. Tessa reportedly knew nothing about Corbin's experience. Nevertheless, her statement contained details that closely matched information contained within county files from earlier reports. Rangers noticed the similarities only after reviewing records during the following year. Tessa spent 2 nights in the forest and described hearing distant voices after dark. She could never distinguish actual words, though the sounds consistently resembled conversations taking place beyond visual range. During her second evening, she reportedly heard footsteps circling her campsite for nearly an hour. Whenever she moved toward the noise, complete silence followed immediately. Investigators later confirmed that no other hikers had registered nearby during that period. The most unusual detail appeared shortly before sunrise. Tessa woke unexpectedly and discovered several stones arranged near a fallen log approximately 30 yards from camp. She later claimed the arrangement had not been present before darkness arrived. Archived ranger notes from 2012 mention photographs taken at the scene, though some records indicate those images were later misplaced. Investigators never confirmed whether the stones had any connection to other reports. As similar accounts accumulated, officials began examining earlier records stored in regional archives. A county file from 2009 referenced a search and rescue volunteer who described hearing distant conversations while assisting during a missing person operation. Another report from 2007 mentioned unexplained footsteps around a temporary camp established by forestry workers. Although details varied, recurring elements appeared often enough to attract attention from local authorities. By 2013, discussions about the reports reached several outdoor organizations operating throughout the Appalachian region. Some members believed environmental conditions created auditory distortions capable of producing convincing illusions. Others pointed toward wildlife activity, arguing that unfamiliar sounds frequently become exaggerated after darkness settles across remote landscapes. Investigators explored both possibilities, yet neither explanation accounted for every detail contained within witness statements. Records conflict regarding several observations, leaving significant gaps in the timeline. One incident from that year generated particular interest. A pair of hikers named Leland Burke and Owen Mercer entered the wilderness for a weekend photography trip. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who routinely traveled through isolated terrain. According to their statements, they heard voices shortly after sunset while preparing dinner beside a stream. Neither individual could identify specific words, though both agreed the sounds resembled a conversation occurring just beyond sight. Leland later reported seeing a light moving slowly between distant trees across the valley. The light appeared briefly before disappearing behind thick vegetation. Owen claimed he never observed it directly, creating one of several conflicting details found throughout the case. Investigators never confirmed whether another group occupied the area that night. Searches conducted afterward located no campsites, discarded equipment, or evidence suggesting recent human activity nearby. The following morning produced another familiar discovery. Several stones rested beside the trail leading away from their campsite. Unlike previous reports, the arrangement formed a rough line extending toward denser forest. Leland photographed the scene and submitted copies during a later interview. Some locals claimed similar markers occasionally appeared throughout remote sections of the region. Investigators never confirmed those accounts and found little supporting documentation. As years passed, additional reports continued appearing within archive notes and ranger files. Many involved experienced hikers who demonstrated familiarity with wilderness conditions. Most accounts described sounds rather than visual encounters. Voices remained the most common element, followed closely by footsteps approaching campsites after dark. While each report contained differences, enough similarities existed to keep the mystery alive among those familiar with regional records. Researchers examining the case proposed several theories. Certain environmental specialists suggested unusual terrain features might reflect sound across valleys in unexpected ways. Under specific conditions, conversations occurring miles away could reportedly seem much closer than reality. Wildlife experts offered alternative explanations involving nocturnal animals whose calls occasionally resemble human voices. Neither theory addressed the recurring stone arrangements mentioned across multiple reports, separated by years and involving unrelated witnesses. A review conducted during 2019 attempted to organize every available statement into a single timeline. Investigators compared dispatch logs, archive notes, witness interviews, and state records gathered over more than a decade. Their findings revealed no evidence of criminal activity, organized hoaxes, or coordinated fabrication. However, they also failed to identify any explanation capable of connecting every reported detail. Several key documents referenced observations that could no longer be verified because supporting material had disappeared. Today, hikers continue traveling through the same wilderness without incident every year. Most never experience anything unusual and return home with ordinary stories about mountain views and long trails. Yet, scattered among those routine accounts remain a small number of reports that sound remarkably similar to statements recorded years earlier. Investigators never confirmed what caused the voices, the footsteps, or the carefully placed stones. Deep within that section of forest, what several hikers reported still doesn't make sense. In this news story, most visitors entered Appalachia expecting breathtaking overlooks, quiet rivers, and endless forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. They planned scenic drives through mountain passes where every curve revealed another postcard view. Few realized those same roads carried generations of stories that never appeared in travel brochures. Long before highways connected distant towns, narrow mountain routes linked isolated communities that depended entirely on one another. Families remembered every bridge, every abandoned church, and every forgotten cemetery hidden among the ridges. Some roads eventually gained quiet reputations that locals rarely discussed with strangers. The warnings usually arrived as simple advice rather than dramatic ghost stories. Older residents suggested reaching the next town before sunset or choosing the longer highway instead of certain backroads. They almost never explained why. For most travelers, those conversations sounded like ordinary mountain folklore. Only years later did some realize they had unknowingly driven through places where unexplained experiences had been reported for generations. One autumn evening, the Harris family began what they believed would become another unforgettable drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark Harris enjoyed photographing abandoned structures, while his wife Jennifer preferred documenting forgotten churches, one-room schoolhouses, and historic cemeteries scattered throughout rural valleys. Their teenage son Ethan spent most trips recording video for a travel channel dedicated to overlooked destinations across America. They had already crossed thousands of miles without experiencing anything stranger than unexpected wildlife crossing the road. Careful planning, reliable equipment, and years of experience convinced them they understood mountain travel better than most tourists. Nothing suggested this journey would become the only trip they refused to repeat. Their route followed a collection of state highways winding through remote sections of eastern Appalachia, where towns sometimes stood nearly 40 miles apart. Cellular reception faded shortly after leaving the interstate. Paper maps replaced navigation apps because the surrounding mountains frequently interrupted satellite signals. The family welcomed the isolation. Modern distractions disappeared almost immediately, leaving only forests stretching endlessly beyond both sides of the pavement. Occasional wooden signs pointed toward communities with populations smaller than a single city block elsewhere in the country. Weather remained perfect throughout the afternoon. Blue skies reflected across narrow rivers flowing beside the highway, while cool mountain air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Shortly before sunset, they stopped at a family-owned diner overlooking a small valley. Local residents filled nearly every table despite the quiet weekday evening. Conversations centered around hunting season, changing weather, and roads damaged during previous winters. When Mark casually mentioned their planned route across an older mountain highway, several conversations briefly stopped before continuing as though nothing had happened. Their waitress hesitated only long enough to ask whether they intended driving that road after dark. Mark answered yes, because the next motel remained less than 90 miles away. She nodded politely before recommending they leave immediately rather than waiting for dessert. Her tone carried concern instead of fear, making the advice strangely memorable. The highway narrowed within minutes after leaving town. fresh pavement gradually gave way to older asphalt, patched repeatedly over decades. Guardrails disappeared along several steep curves overlooking valleys that vanished beneath growing darkness. Dense hardwood forests pressed tightly against both sides of the road until branches formed a tunnel overhead. Traffic became almost non-existent. During nearly 40 minutes, they encountered only one pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. Its driver briefly flashed headlights twice before disappearing around the next bend. Jennifer assumed the signal warned about deer farther ahead. Ethan continued filming through the windshield, hoping to capture the fading evening light filtering between towering ridges. Darkness arrived much faster than expected beneath the forest canopy. Mark switched to high beams, revealing countless tree trunks standing like silent walls only a few feet beyond the pavement. Fog slowly gathered inside low valleys before drifting upward across the highway. Visibility remained acceptable, yet every curve looked strangely similar to the previous one. Ethan eventually lowered his camera after noticing something unusual. Mile markers seemed inconsistent. Marker 63 appeared first, followed several minutes later by marker 61. Another curve revealed marker 64 again. Mark assumed he had simply misread them while concentrating on the winding road. Ethan replayed his recording and quietly confirmed the numbers appeared exactly as remembered. Jennifer unfolded their paper map beneath the interior light. According to the route, they should have reached a small crossroads community nearly 15 minutes earlier. Instead, the forest continued uninterrupted in every direction. No driveways appeared, no mailboxes stood beside the pavement, even electrical lines seemed to vanish beyond the last ridge they crossed. The silence outside gradually became noticeable. Normally, mountain roads echoed with insects, distant streams, or occasional owls. Here, the surrounding forest appeared completely still, despite gentle wind moving across the higher slopes. When Mark lowered his window for several seconds, he heard nothing except the steady hum of the engine. Another 20 minutes passed before headlights illuminated an old white church standing beside the road. A narrow cemetery surrounded the building behind a weathered iron fence, leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Jennifer asked whether they could stop for photographs the following morning because moonlight gave the place an unusual appearance. Mark slowed slightly but continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up from his camera and quietly asked why they were passing the same church again. Nobody answered immediately. The identical leaning fence, cracked front steps, and broken stained glass window stood exactly where they had appeared before. Mark insisted another church probably resembled the first one because many rural congregations used nearly identical architecture. Ethan remained unconvinced after comparing both video clips side by side. The family finally reached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. Beside the entrance stood an old wooden warning sign faded almost beyond recognition. Jennifer noticed a distinctive lightning-shaped crack running through one corner of the board. 15 minutes later, another bridge appeared. The same crack marked another weathered sign, standing in exactly the same position. Ethan searched his earlier footage again before quietly showing the screen to his parents. Every knot in the wood matched perfectly. Even missing paint formed identical patterns. Mark felt the first genuine wave of uncertainty since entering the mountains. He checked the odometer. According to the vehicle, they had traveled nearly 60 additional miles, yet every landmark suggested otherwise. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. Mark attempted turning onto the first side road they encountered, hoping it would reconnect with another highway. Less than 5 minutes later, the narrow lane curved unexpectedly before returning to the same main road from the opposite direction. The old bridge stood ahead once again. Jennifer suggested consulting a compass stored inside the glove compartment. The needle refused to settle in one direction, drifting slowly before stopping, then turning again without obvious reason. Ethan tried restarting his phone, even though no signal remained available. The digital map loaded briefly before displaying their location several counties away, then disappeared completely. None of the devices agreed with one another. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle finally appeared behind them. Relief spread through the family until Jennifer noticed something unsettling. The headlights never seemed to grow closer, despite following for nearly 15 minutes. They remained the same distance back through every curve, occasionally disappearing behind hills before returning exactly where they had been before. Mark reduced speed, hoping the driver would pass. The lights slowed as well. He accelerated slightly. They matched his pace again without gaining or falling farther behind. Ethan filmed through the rear window until the headlights vanished completely while rounding one sharp bend. The road behind them remained empty for miles afterward. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small gas station illuminated by a single fluorescent light. Relief quickly turned into confusion after discovering the pumps covered with rust and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Dust coated every window. The building had obviously been abandoned for years. Jennifer later recalled feeling certain she had seen the lights glowing from nearly a mile away, yet no electrical service appeared connected anywhere on the property. Ethan photographed the station before they continued driving. The digital timestamps on every image later showed conflicting times despite being taken only seconds apart. Some indicated photographs captured before they entered the highway, while others appeared almost 2 hours into the future. No explanation ever accounted for the corrupted sequence. The highway finally emerged from the mountains shortly before dawn. A larger state road appeared ahead, along with the first passing traffic they had seen in hours. They stopped at a convenience store where the cashier immediately asked whether they had spent the night on the old mountain route. Without describing their experience, Mark simply nodded. The cashier quietly explained that travelers occasionally arrived exhausted after believing they had driven in circles despite following the same highway. Most blamed heavy fog, unfamiliar terrain, or fatigue. Others refused discussing the experience altogether. Local law enforcement had investigated numerous reports over the years, yet found no damaged signs, missing intersections, or roadway defects capable of explaining why unrelated visitors described remarkably similar experiences separated by decades. Back home, the Harris family reviewed every photograph, map, and video collected during the trip. Mileage records, timestamps, and recorded landmarks refused to fit into any logical sequence. Nothing proved anything supernatural had occurred. Mountain roads, exhaustion, changing weather, and human perception could easily combine in unexpected ways. Researchers studying navigation errors have long documented how isolated environments distort distance, direction, and memory, especially after dark. Even so, one detail remained impossible for the family to ignore. Ethan's continuous dashboard recording showed the same weathered church appearing twice without any visible turnaround, intersection, or break in the journey. Every attempt to retrace the route months later failed because neither the church nor the abandoned gas station could be located where maps indicated they should have been. Today, the family still visits Appalachia, but they never travel unfamiliar mountain roads after sunset. Whenever someone asks why, they simply recommend reaching the next town before dark, repeating the same quiet advice once offered to them without explanation. In this new story, when investigators review emergency calls from the Appalachian Mountains, they quickly discover that the most unusual reports rarely involve violent crimes or major disasters. Instead, many begin with ordinary people describing something that simply did not make sense. A driver refuses to leave a vehicle after seeing someone standing beside an empty road. A family abandons a campsite before sunrise without taking their belongings. A veteran hunter suddenly turns around after spending decades walking the same trails. Most of those incidents are eventually explained through weather, wildlife, or simple misunderstanding. Others remain preserved inside county files because every practical explanation failed to account for the evidence. One such investigation began during the final week of July 2019 in a remote section of eastern Tennessee, where several unrelated travelers reported the same disturbing encounter after driving through the mountains long after dark. The reports all centered on Hollow Creek Road, a narrow two-lane highway winding through dense forest less than 15 miles from the Tennessee-North Carolina border. During daylight hours, the route was popular with hikers and anglers traveling toward nearby public lands. After sunset, however, traffic dropped dramatically. The road contained long stretches without homes, businesses, or reliable cellular service. Local deputies routinely patrolled the area because stranded motorists occasionally required assistance after hitting wildlife or suffering mechanical problems. Serious criminal activity remained rare, making the sudden increase in emergency calls during one particular week immediately stand out to investigators reviewing dispatch records. The first report came from a retired couple returning home after visiting relatives. Shortly before 11 o'clock, they contacted emergency dispatch after noticing a person standing beside the road near an abandoned wooden bridge. According to their statement, the individual appeared to be wearing dark clothing and remained completely still as their vehicle approached. Concerned that someone might have been injured or attempting to flag down passing traffic, the driver slowed to offer assistance. Before the vehicle reached the bridge, however, the figure disappeared behind the guardrail without crossing the road or entering the surrounding forest. Believing the person might have fallen down the steep embankment, the couple immediately contacted authorities. A deputy arrived less than 15 minutes later and searched both sides of the bridge using high-powered flashlights. Fresh rain earlier that evening had softened the muddy ground surrounding the roadside, creating excellent conditions for preserving footprints. Investigators found no tire tracks, footprints, or signs that anyone had recently climbed the embankment. The creek below remained shallow enough that an injured person could not have been carried away by the current. After completing a thorough search, the deputy concluded that the witnesses had probably mistaken a tree stump or roadside marker for a person while driving through darkness. The report was filed without further investigation. 2 nights later, dispatch received another call involving the exact same location. This time, the witness was an experienced commercial truck driver transporting livestock across the state. Unlike the previous callers, he carried a continuously recording dashboard camera. According to his report, he noticed what appeared to be a person standing beside the bridge long before reaching the location because the reflective stripes on the figure's clothing briefly caught his headlights. Expecting someone to wave for help, he reduced speed while preparing to stop. Instead, the figure remained motionless until the truck rounded the final curve. At that point, it disappeared from view. The driver immediately checked both side mirrors, expecting to see someone walking along the shoulder. The road behind him remained completely empty. Investigators obtained the dashboard camera footage, hoping it would identify the individual. The recording confirmed that the driver slowed significantly while approaching the bridge. It also showed a faint upright shape near the roadside, lasting only a fraction of a second before disappearing behind the truck's headlights. Image specialists enhanced the footage repeatedly, but could not determine whether the object represented a person, vegetation, or a brief lighting distortion caused by moisture on the camera lens. The video neither confirmed nor disproved the driver's statement, leaving detectives with evidence that raised more questions than answers. The investigation expanded after 3 additional motorists reported remarkably similar experiences during the following week. None of the witnesses knew one another, and each contacted emergency dispatch before local media became aware of the earlier reports. Every statement described the same section of Hollow Creek Road. Every witness believed they had seen someone standing beside the abandoned bridge. Every search conducted immediately afterward found nothing. Detectives carefully compared timelines, weather conditions, traffic volume, and witness backgrounds, expecting to identify a common factor linking the reports. The only consistent element remained the location itself. Rather than increasing routine patrols, the sheriff assigned 2 deputies to remain hidden near the bridge during several consecutive nights. Their objective was simple. If someone was deliberately frightening motorists, officers intended to intercept the individual before another emergency call occurred. The deputies positioned their vehicles well away from the highway and monitored the bridge using night vision equipment. Hours passed without incident. Shortly before midnight on the third night, one deputy observed a vehicle suddenly slowing as it approached the bridge before accelerating away moments later. Dispatch immediately received another call from the driver reporting a person standing beside the roadway. The deputies reached the exact location in less than 40 seconds. Once again, nobody was there. Following that incident, engineers from the Tennessee Department of Transportation inspected the roadway, searching for reflective signs, damaged guardrails, unusual shadows, or roadside objects capable of creating the illusion of a standing person under certain lighting conditions. Surveyors mapped every tree, utility pole, and roadside marker visible from approaching vehicles. Computer simulations using identical vehicle headlights failed to recreate the appearance consistently described by witnesses. Although several combinations of shadows briefly resembled human shapes, none matched the reported height, position, or timing documented throughout the investigation. Detectives reluctantly ruled out the possibility that every witness had experienced the same optical illusion. As investigators reviewed older county archives, they discovered something unexpected. Nearly 23 years earlier, highway maintenance supervisors had submitted several reports describing motorists stopping along the same bridge after believing someone had been standing beside the road. Those reports contained no mention of ghost stories, local legends, or supernatural explanations. Instead, maintenance crews requested additional warning signs because drivers repeatedly braked unexpectedly while passing through the area after dark. The request was eventually denied after engineers failed to identify any roadway hazard requiring corrective action. The documents were quietly archived and forgotten until the current investigation brought them to light decades later. The sheriff officially closed the case after 6 weeks without identifying a suspect, uncovering evidence of criminal activity, or documenting additional reports. No missing persons were connected to the location, and no witnesses ever claimed the figure attempted to approach their vehicles or communicate with them. Detectives deliberately avoided labeling the incident as paranormal, concluding only that repeated witness observations could not be explained using the available evidence. Even today, Hollow Creek Road remains open to public traffic, carrying thousands of vehicles every year without incident. Yet, among local deputies who worked the investigation, one memory has endured. Every driver who reported the mysterious figure described the same reaction before contacting emergency dispatch. None believed they had encountered a ghost. Every one of them believed they had seen an ordinary person who desperately needed help. That simple assumption was exactly what brought them back to the bridge, and exactly what they could never explain. In this new story, witnesses still can't explain these ghost encounters. In November of 2012, a remote forestry station near Greenwater, Washington, became the focus of an unresolved investigation. Local authorities received multiple contradictory statements from experienced wilderness professionals who encountered something they simply could not identify on the mountain. Mark Vance was a 34-year-old wildlife biologist who spent weeks tracking nocturnal animal populations across the dense Pacific Northwest Territory. He shared a temporary field cabin with Sarah Jenkins, a 28-year-old forestry technician who mapped severe trail erosion there. According to archive notes, their primary objective was purely scientific and required them to remain outdoors during late-night hours. The environment was notoriously challenging because thick fog frequently rolled through the valley, drastically reducing visibility for anyone in the woods. On the night of November 14, Mark set up motion-activated trail cameras along a deeply isolated ridgeline. Official dispatch logs later confirmed that his radio communication suddenly ceased at exactly 11:45 in the evening that night. Sarah remained at the base cabin, but reportedly noticed an unusual drop in voltage that caused all their electronics to flicker. She attempted to contact him several times, but the radio emitted nothing except a steady, high-pitched static sound instead. State records indicate that weather conditions were completely clear at the base station, which ruled out immediate storm interference entirely. Up on the ridge, Mark reportedly observed a dark silhouette standing completely motionless near one of his newly positioned cameras. He assumed it was a local hiker, so he called out a loud warning about the steep drop-off ahead of them. The figure did not respond to his voice, but it moved backward into the heavy brush with remarkable, silent speed. When Mark walked over to investigate the specific area, he found absolutely no footprints left behind in the damp mud. This detail was particularly baffling because the soil was very soft, meaning any human presence would definitely leave deep impressions. He recovered the camera unit and immediately returned to the base station to review the digital images with Sarah. The county file from 2009 detailed a similar incident where equipment failed, but these current photographs showed something else. The first 3 frames captured a completely blank trail, yet the 4th frame contained a bizarre, distorted visual anomaly. A pale shape was visible beneath the tree line, but its outlines were completely blurred due to unexplained light refraction. Investigators never confirmed if this distortion was caused by a faulty lens mechanism or an actual physical object passing by. Some locals claimed the area was historically prone to unusual magnetic variations that frequently disrupted electronic recording devices there. However, Sarah noticed that the temperature sensors on the camera logged an immediate drop of 20 degrees within 1 minute. The official regional weather data completely contradicted this finding, showing a perfectly stable climate across the entire mountain range. Records conflict regarding whether this brief localized freeze was an environmental anomaly or simply an instrumentation error by the team. The next morning, the 2 researchers decided to examine the ridge together during the clear daylight hours to find answers. They discovered that several heavy branches near the camera site were cleanly snapped off at a height of 8 feet. No heavy machinery operated in that protected zone, and wildlife officials confirmed no large animals matched that specific damage pattern. Furthermore, the broken wood fibers appeared completely dehydrated, which was highly unusual given the constant dampness of the rainforest. A nearby park ranger later filed an auxiliary report stating he heard low-frequency humming throughout the previous night. By the afternoon, the local sheriff department dispatched a single officer to conduct a routine check of the area. The responding deputy noted that both scientists seemed highly credible and showed no signs of panic or mutual deception. He searched the perimeter for evidence of unauthorized trespassers, but his search yielded absolutely no physical evidence of intruders. The official report concluded that an unknown animal or a transient hiker likely caused the disturbance on the ridgeline. However, the file remains open today because several technical contradictions in the equipment logs were never fully explained by experts. Independent analysts don't agree on the actual source of the extreme temperature drops recorded by the field equipment. Some experts believe that a localized thermal inversion occurred, while others maintain that the digital sensor simply experienced a malfunction. We can't definitely prove either theory because the original camera unit was later lost during a routine transport to town. The case remains one of the most unusual mysteries in the region, leaving both witnesses without any clear answers.